Okay, so Joe, it's great to see you, and it's fantastic to talk to someone who's been working I suppose, all your academic career on Anthropology of Scotland, more
That's
or
right.
less.
Yeah.
And
Yes, that's true.
you're as will be picked up from your accent, you're from Scotland as well.
Yeah. So while I full disclosure, I grew up in Canada, but moved to Ellen, which is just north of Aberdeen, home of Brewdog beer. We moved there when I was a teenager. So
Uh,
my whole
well,
adult life surely has been in
yeah.
Scotland.
Well, the relationship between Scotland and Canada can wait for another day's discussion, I
Yeah,
suppose. Yeah.
definitely.
Okay, so the reason I wanted to talk to you today was thinking about a couple of years ago when you gave evidence to the Scottish Parliament Justice Committee, and this was on to give it its full name, the Offensive Behaviour at Football and Threatening Communication Scotland Act 2012.
That's
So
right.
first off, can you explain a bit to us about, well, what is the Offensive Behaviour at Football and Threatening Communication Scotland Act 2012? And how does an anthropologist end up being an expert witness on this?
Okay, so I'm going to refer to it as the Football Act, just to keep things shorter. Some people call it the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, so I might use both of those terms. But essentially, the Football Act was an attempt to deal with, as the Scottish government saw it, the problem of sectarianism within football matches and around football matches, primarily in relation to sectarian chanting. So for a
Mm-hmm.
long time, Scottish politics and the Scottish media have been debating the problem of sectarianism, and debating how big of a problem is it and how to deal with it. Previous commentators have frequently referred to sectarianism in Scotland as Scotland's shame.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a sense in the public consciousness that sectarianism is a big problem in Scotland, particularly in the kind of Western Central Belt, obviously, particularly in Glasgow. So the Football Act came about kind of in response to some particularly disruptive Old Firm matches when Celtic and Rangers played each other, and there were issues around public disorder and sectarian violence. And the Scottish government decided that they wanted to try and bring in a new law to clamp down on particularly sectarian chanting,
Okay.
in an attempt to I guess, discourage people from using those types of chants, like the Billy Boys, or particular Celtic inspired chants, which have lyrics which make reference to the IRA. Just to give you two relevant examples, one from each side. And the legislation was written essentially to kind of prescribe or make illegal very particular sets of lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with the legislation was that in addition to making very specific chants illegal, it also at the same time left wide open what was defined as offensive.
Okay.
Which then left the police in a very difficult position of having to interpret in a whole range of different circumstances what was and was not prescribed by the law.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, the police interpret things all the time, and they generally do a very good job of it. They're professionals, but this law really had a pretty tricky combination of being very specific about a certain set of songs that were banned, and yet at the same time leaving a whole other range of behaviors around football potentially challenged under the law, but depending on your interpretation, some people said that those other sets of behaviors were completely fine. So
Right.
it was a really difficult law to implement. And the other basic fact is, if anyone's been to a football match, particularly a Celtic or a Rangers match, if you have 2 or 3 or 4,000 people all singing a particular banned sectarian lyric at the same time, the police are just not going to be able to mass arrest 2,000 or 3,000 people. It's impossible. So there were concerns about interpreting the law. There were concerns about the fact that the law was pretty much unenforceable. And I guess thirdly, there were people who said, look, this is a challenge to free speech. We should not ban certain words. We can't make phrases or song lyrics illegal. So there were all of those things were at the center of the debate about whether or not this act was working.
Right. Because I'm a football fan, and when you're chanting, you're trying to get under the skin of the opposition. That's that's what you're trying to do. And so I suppose the issue here is where do you draw the line between things which are antagonistic and things which are antagonistic in a way that's deemed offensive under this act? And that's putting the police in a particularly difficult position. That was putting
but also think of it like this, in most cases, being offensive is not illegal, because if it were, then most comedy clubs would have to be shut down. So normally the line in terms of what was illegal and what wasn't would be drawn around incitement to violence. And that has been a kind of long-standing line in the sand when free speech tips over into something unacceptable. If you're seen as inciting violence, then that's seen as an appropriate way to figure out what should and should not be illegal. I should maybe even take a step back here and say that this was also based on a wider research project. So I wasn't just doing research on Celtic and Rangers and on football in Scotland and looking at sectarianism, but it was part of a bigger project on the Orange Order, which is how I kind of came into this topic.
Sure. I mean, so that's where I wanted to get with, it's so why was it that you gave evidence on this topic? What was your background that led to you making that intervention?
So the research was on Protestant fraternities. So I'm someone in the anthropology of religion. I specialize in studying religion in Scotland, and particularly Protestant fundamentalism of different types. So I began a new study on the Orange Order to try and answer questions about what Protestantism looks like if church life and if the kind of normal ideas about what makes a kind of pious or a holy person, like never swearing and never getting drunk, what if those things didn't apply, right? What if we could still point to a type of Protestantism which wasn't your typical middle class, socially constrained Church of Scotland or Free Church or Brethren or Jehovah's Witness or whatever it happens to be, right? What if we didn't look for those behavioral markers, but instead we looked at a version of Protestantism that looked really, really different, that celebrated rivalry and drinking and football and was completely okay with not going to church and was quite a kind of sweary version of Protestantism. Can we still call that Protestant? That was what the project was about. And that took me from research on the Orange Order and kind of then sucked me into a bigger research project on loyalism in the Central Belt, looking at Airdrie and Glasgow in particular. So spending time with Orangemen meant by default that I was spending time with Rangers fans, which then meant that I was going to Rangers matches, going to Rangers bars, hanging out with these people, trying to figure out what made them tick. And as Rangers and at that time, the Football Act became a bigger part of the context. I began observing football fans more and more, and it was that set of observations, kind of doing people watching with football fans over a period of a number of years, that finally led me to be asked by the Scottish government to help them out with deciding whether or not they should repeal the law. That was really what they were trying to figure out. Should we fix the law or should we just ditch it completely? And in the end, in 2018, they actually repealed it. They got rid of the law completely. Yeah.
And what did the people that you were working with make of that intervention? Did you feed that back to them?
I did, yeah. So they were pretty vocal with me that they thought that the law was a bad law, and they felt, now when I say they, I mean Rangers supporting Orangemen, felt that the law was unfairly targeting them and them alone. They felt that the law was not being applied to Celtic fans in the same way that it was being applied to Rangers fans. Now, interestingly, having also spoken to Celtic fans, they said the opposite. They felt that they were being uniquely targeted. So it kind of cut both ways. But yes, I was involved with a few different Rangers fan groups. There's a big fanzine and kind of online forum called Follow Follow. It's the kind of biggest Rangers fanzine. And they picked up on some of the work that I was doing and discussed it amongst themselves. And they were pretty supportive of what I was trying to do. And more generally, there was a lot of rejoicing among both Celtic and Rangers fans when the law was eventually repealed, because they felt that it was, you know, that it was a bad law. It was stopping them from chanting in the way that they wanted to chant. So they were happy when it was repealed.
Okay, so zooming back a bit to the broader research project that this was part of. What were the kind of challenges of doing field work in that kind of setting?
Okay, I think the first thing to say is that my two major challenges for getting the Orange Order to agree to have me along, to let me hang out with them to do this research, was about access and was about trust. So first I needed to get permission from them to spend time among their membership. And secondly, over a much longer period of time, I needed to build up relationships of trust with lots of different Orangemen in order for them to be willing to share their lives with me and talk about the things that they were concerned about. And initially, I started off doing a lot of research in the Grand Orange Lodge archive, speaking to just 3 men who were there on a weekly basis as kind of local historians doing the history of the Orange Order. So I spent time with them, and then as I got to know them, I met lots of other Orangemen who were coming into Grand Lodge. That then led to another breakthrough where I began to spend a lot of time in a particular Orange social club. It's like an Orange members-only bar. I spent a huge amount of time in that particular place getting to know Orangemen. And then during the referendum, which we'll maybe talk about later, I was also shadowing people who were campaigning during the referendum. But getting that access and getting that trust took a long time, and it kind of constantly needed to be renegotiated as I met new people and tried to figure out how I was going to explain who I was and what I was doing.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, what did you have to then make decisions? You'd obviously have to make decisions on the spot about how to behave in this kind of fieldwork setting. I mean, you said, for example, that you're in drinking clubs and that kind of thing. Are you having to then make decisions about how far you can participate in the social life of that?
That's right. No, so it wasn't easy. So that's a really good practical example. And I remember constantly being mocked for drinking diet iron brew, right? Sugar-free iron brew instead of drinking.
That is a double shame, isn't it?
Missing the point entirely twice over. So yeah, that there were issues around drinking, and to keep a clear head, I didn't drink when I was doing the field work. I guess there were also issues around, you know, hearing really sectarian conversations, and again around football matches. You know, what did I do and how would I act if I was with a group of people who were doing things that the Football Act made illegal? So walking that line was tricky, and I think part of it was made easier than it could have been because I was always open with the people I was with that I wasn't a member. I wasn't a member of the Orange Order, and although some people over time kind of forgot that I wasn't an Orange member, and you know, I had several strange experiences where people extended an orange grip. So Orangemen, like Freemasons, have a secret handshake, and you can either reciprocate the handshake or not, and I never did, and that led to people suddenly kind of realizing that I wasn't a member of the Orange Order in these group situations, and trying to be clear that I wasn't a member of the Orange Order, but I was sympathetic to the extent that I wanted to understand why they believed what they believed and why they did the things that they did. That was the best method I had for gaining trust, which was just showing a willingness to listen, especially listened to a group of people who the Scottish media in general had no interest in listening to at all, right? The Orange Order have this horrific PR problem, and most Orangemen are very aware that the public at large don't like them.
Mm-hmm.
And my job, my challenge as I was doing the research was, I suppose, to show Orangemen that I wasn't just another journalist looking for a story to make them look bad, but instead I was someone who wanted to understand why they were doing what they were doing, and to understand them by, as much as possible, kind of stepping into their world. That was what I was trying to do.
Yeah. So that brings me on to one of my, it's fair to say that the Orange Order, that this is something which provokes some very strong feelings. When I was growing up in Liverpool, the Orange Order marched down our street, and I mean, funnily enough, because I grew up with this and have these strong childhood memories of it, it's actually quite a fond memory of childhood, even though I'm Catholic.
Yeah.
Imagining that, the marching band down the street. But even saying that to some people, I get hostility just for saying, well, actually, it's a fond childhood memory. So in that kind of setting, that kind of divisive setting, how do you cope with it? How do you manage the fact it's so divisive?
Yeah, so I think, as I said, when I managed that among Orangemen by saying over and over again to them, and not just with my words, but I guess with the fact that I kept showing up and I kept listening, that I wasn't interested in telling a story that kind of selectively painted the Orange Order in a very bad light. And that meant spending time with the same people in the same places over a period of years, getting to know them as people, sharing my life with them in the same way that they shared their lives with me. And that long-term process of listening helped me to kind of diffuse their reaction to that type of divisiveness, right? Because they knew they were divisive, and sometimes they would kind of perform that for me, and they would tell sectarian jokes, and they would do and say things, and then look for my reaction and see whether I was judging them. And that was just more chance for discussion. But on the other hand, what you say is quite right, that the strongest reactions I got were actually not from Orangemen, but from other anthropologists who were kind of, some were horrified, others were intrigued, but slightly disturbed by the fact that I wanted to spend time with these people who they felt, from their viewpoint, were nothing but kind of sectarian bigots. And pushing back on that was in a sense even harder, because I wasn't used to having people within my own world of work who also work in universities and do this type of research react quite so negatively to what I was doing. And I guess there it was just trying to point out that if anthropology studies people, then the Orange Order are full of people, and we should try and figure out why they're doing what they're doing.
I mean, I guess it speaks to a basic presumption there is in anthropology, because of the kind of immersive work that ethnographers do, that there's an assumption that the work that we do is inherently sympathetic to the people, that essentially we're walking in their shoes, we're taking their side. And I think for anthropology, that does create certain kinds of moral dilemmas where we're saying, well, whose side is it right to, whose side is it right to take the side of? Whose shoes should we be walking in?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think the reality of the ethnographic method, which is how we do our research as anthropologists, as you say, kind of living among people, trying to walk in their shoes, that method means that you begin to sympathize with people in ways that maybe you didn't expect you would at the start of your research. If you spend enough time with the same group of people, eventually some of the things that they do and say and think are going to rub off on you, at least insofar as you'll you'll begin to see where they're coming from. You'll begin to see why they're doing what they're doing in a way that you didn't think was possible before you started spending so much time with them. And that can be a bit, well, it can certainly be disorientating, right? You kind of begin to lose some of the assumptions that you thought were obvious before, and you have those challenged, and suddenly you're left thinking, you know, why is their world, even if it's a world that's kind of colored by sectarian and bigoted views, why is that world suddenly making more sense to me than it did before? Right? And that can be a bit disturbing. And as an anthropologist, I guess I would say that's probably our only way to learn new things about the world, is by letting ourselves be sucked into a world to the extent that it challenges what we once thought was obvious and true. And if we don't let ourselves get pulled into that extent, then I'm not sure why we're doing what we're doing. What's the point if we're not going to listen, especially listen to things that are uncomfortable to hear, and if we're not going to watch things that are uncomfortable to watch?
Yeah. No, thanks. That's really helpful. Really helpful for me as well, because I've worked in situations where, for example, working on climate change research and having conversations with people who are very strong climate change deniers and know that that's not my position. And obviously, you know, there's a kind of, and you're learning from them, and you're learning why it is that they come to that position, in a way which doesn't necessarily mean that you're then ending up accepting that position. It means that you're understanding what it is that what it is they're trying to say.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, anthropology doesn't always end in you going native, right? And you kind of converting to the way that they think and live. But I think I've always tried to hold in the back of my mind, the bit of research that I did before this was with the Exclusive Brethren. They're a socially very separatist group, and they have a very intense interest in the end of the world and looking for signs that the apocalypse is about to happen. And for both of the projects that I've done with the Brethren and with the Orange Order, I've tried to hold in the back of my mind the question, what if they're right, and what if I'm wrong? What if they have understood how the world works, and what if I'm just mistaken? And forcing myself to constantly ask that is, I think, for me at least, the only way I can keep reminding myself to hear what they're saying, because otherwise I'm just going to kind of be impervious to what they're trying to tell me, and that's not what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. So the last couple of questions I had, just thinking about the context in which you're doing the research. The first thing you mentioned was you were doing this work with Orange Lodge at the time of the Scottish independence referendum.
Yes.
How does that kind of work shed a light on that moment in Scotland's history? Yeah,
that's really interesting. So I think the first thing to say is that all of the mainstream political parties in Scotland, Labour, Conservatives, Liberal Democrat, the SNP, they all agreed on what the issues were, right? They didn't agree on what the policies should be, but they all agreed that what was at stake here was the economy, or Scotland's place within an international community of nations, or how to fund a health service, or what type of taxation they wanted, right? That they agreed on the basic building blocks of the issues, not on the policies, but at least on what the issues that they should debate. What I learned by spending time with the Orange Order during the independence referendum is that the Orange Order completely rejected the fact that those were the basic issues that needed to be debated and discussed. Not because they thought that they were unimportant, they didn't, right? They think that the economy is important and that you know, the way in which Scotland relates to other nations is important. Of course they do, but they didn't think that was the main issue. For them, the main issue was whether or not Scotland would remain part of the United Kingdom and therefore remain under the leadership of the Queen as, in their view, a Protestant monarch who protected Scotland's status as a Protestant nation. So that was their main concern, was that if Scotland go independent, they will no longer have the same safeguards to Scotland as a Protestant nation, in their view, right, that they would want to maintain. So doing research with the Orange Order about the independence referendum during that whole debate reminded me that there's this whole group of people out there. I mean, the Orange Order is the largest Protestant fraternity in Scotland. Some people have calculated that it has many, many more members than several of the major political parties in Scotland, right? So the Orange Order are a major force just in terms of sheer numbers of members. So they can't be dismissed on that basis, which makes it all the more important to think, hold on a minute, there's a very large membership-bound society out there who fundamentally understands that the referendum is about something completely different.
Right, which then sheds light on more widely on how narrowly the terms of the debate were conceived, which is something which in the autopsies after the referendum, I think, you know, that was something that was widely discussed. You know, why was independence defined specifically in these terms, to do with, as you say, economics?
To do with economics, to do with all different types of civic nationalism. Yeah, you're right. And the consequence, I guess, was that the Orange Order, and this was very explicitly claimed by different people within the kind of mainstream debate, if I can put it like that, the Orange Order were publicly repudiated, right? None of the political parties on the unionist side, on the no side of the debate, were willing to engage at all with the Orange Order.
I remember at the time that their involvement was seen as something of an embarrassment. You know, the last thing you want in a Better Together event is for the Orange Order to turn up with their sashes.
And the question is why, right? Why were they an embarrassment? And on one level, the answer is they were seen and still are seen as a sectarian organization. That is true. But on another level, the answer is that the Orange Order just were kind of offering a completely different message, right? They would not stop talking about Britishness and the Queen and Protestantism. And that, for most people, certainly most people within Better Together, completely missed the point of the debate. Now, the question then becomes, on a very one-dimensional level, who's right? Right? What is the referendum really about? And I suppose just realizing the fact that there might be more than one answer to the question, what is the referendum about, is really important, right? Maybe the referendum was not about, at least for everyone, it wasn't about what we thought it was.
Okay, I'll let you go in a minute, Joe, because I know you've got things to be getting on with family. But just to finish off with, because you touched on your previous work with the Brethren in Aberdeenshire. Obviously, both this and the previous project have been about religion in Scotland. Why is it that you choose to focus on that topic? I mean, given that you're studying religion at a time when the kirks are emptying out, when there's more and more of a secular consensus in the public sphere in Scotland, why for you does it matter to study religion at such a time?
Okay, so I mean, it's a good question. I guess it gets to the heart of what we call secularization, the idea, as you say, that people are becoming less and less religious. They're less likely to go to church. The kirks are emptying. Religion is no longer the same influential force in society that it used to be. And there are different people who've pushed back on that idea for different reasons. But I guess ultimately my sense is that the exclusive brethren, the Orange Order, in different ways help us to see that religion might not just be about church attendance, to take the kind of classic measure of whether or not we're living in a secular society. So if we can't reduce religion to the kind of yardstick of church attendance, then what is it about? And for the exclusive brethren, they have a very complicated but very interesting idea that yes, church attendance is going down and down, right? So in that sense, they agree that secularization is real, but they say, look, this has been predicted in the Bible. We are living in the end of days exactly because the kirks and the churches and the brethren halls are emptying. People are forgetting about God, and that is a kind of supernatural reality prophesied in the Bible, which proves that God and his word are true and accurate. So the brethren look at secularization and they say it's real, but it's not evidence that religion is unimportant, but they say the opposite, right? That secularization is real and therefore it proves our Bible-based view of the world, which makes religion all the more important. The Orange Order are someone who says that we are Protestant, but by and large, most of the grassroots members I spent time among did not see church attendance as important. Instead, they saw going to football matches and spending time drinking with their Protestant brethren as the thing that made them religious. So to answer your question, studying religion in Scotland using ethnography, using anthropology, by speaking to real people and understanding their real lives over a period of years rather than running in, doing a survey and then leaving, right? By doing that detailed, embedded research, what you learn is that the thing that we call religion is maybe just much more complex and messy than the idea of religion being primarily measured by church attendance or other formal measures like how many people are getting married in church or how many people are getting buried in church. You know, what if those things are not the yardstick that we should be using? And if those aren't the yardsticks that we should be using, then maybe religion is something different to what we thought it was. And the conclusion of the research I did with the Orange Order is that for the Orange Order, religion is a kind of ethnicity. It's a kind of racial category. The Orange Order talk about religion, they talk about Protestantism as being in their blood. And I don't think they're being metaphorical there. I think they really mean that. They really live and believe and experience their physical makeup, Protestantism, as something which kind of courses through their veins, which means that you can never go to church and that doesn't change the fact that you're a Protestant. And if that's right, or at least if that's one way of looking at religion, then maybe that means that we have to completely rethink what we thought something like secularization was in the first place.
Thank you. That's been brilliant, Joe. I'll leave it there. I think that's a great note to finish on. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, Richard. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.